Picture a man who once stood at the very top of the sporting world. A man who, on a single February night in 1978, climbed into a Las Vegas ring and walked out as the heavyweight champion of the entire world. Not a regional champion, not a contender, the undisputed king of the most glamorous, most dangerous title in all of sports. His name was Leon Spinks, and for one shining moment, he was the most talked about athlete on the planet. Now picture something else. By 2005, public records and press reports documented that same man working as a janitor at a YMCA and at a McDonald's in the quiet town of Columbus, Nebraska. A Boston Globe article from December 21st of that year carried a title that said everything you needed to know. They called it, simply, Riches to Rags. Think about that contrast for a moment. The heavyweight championship of the world, a title once held by Joe Louis, by Rocky Marciano, by Muhammad Ali himself, somehow traveled from a roaring Las Vegas arena all the way to a mop bucket in small-town Nebraska. How does that happen? How does a man go from beating the most famous athlete alive to cleaning floors for an hourly wage? That is the mystery we are going to unravel. Because the story of Leon Spinks is not just a boxing story. It is a story about what fame can do and what it cannot protect. It is a story of Olympic gold won alongside his own brother on one unforgettable night, of an upset so enormous that grown men refused to believe it, of a fall so fast it left the boxing world dizzy, of a family marked by tragedy, and of silent, accumulating damage done to a man's brain, one punch at a time, over decades inside the ropes. There are forgotten truths buried in this man's life, and before he ever held a belt, before the flashbulbs in the Sports Illustrated cover, there was a poor kid in St. Louis with a gap-toothed grin and a path that ran straight through the United States Marine Corps. Leon Spinks was born on the 11th of July, 1953, in St. Louis, Missouri. And from the very start, life did not hand him much. He grew up in poverty, in a city and an era that offered precious little to a black child without money or connections. This was America in the 1950s and 60s, with the long shadow of segregation still hanging over everyday life, and with opportunity rationed out in cruel and uneven portions. In that environment, boxing was never about glamour. It was about survival. It was about finding the one open door in a hallway full of locked ones. For generations of young black athletes in cities like St. Louis, the fight game represented something rare. A chance. A way out. A lottery ticket that you paid for with your own blood and your own willingness to get hit. But Leon was not the only fighter in his family. He had a brother named Michael, and that name is going to matter enormously before this story is done. Because what began as two brothers from a hard St. Louis neighborhood, two kids with almost nothing, would eventually become one of the most remarkable family stories in the entire history of American sport. For now, though, they were simply poor. Two young men in a struggling city looking for a way to turn their fists into a future. And the cultural backdrop of the early 1970s pressed down on them the way it pressed down on so many. Limited options, a society still wrestling with deeply rooted injustice, and sport standing there as both a pressure valve and a dream. Leon would chase that dream, but to escape the life he was born into, he did something many fighters never did. Before he ever turned professional, he put on a different uniform first, one with the eagle, the globe, and the anchor. In 1973, Leon Spinks joined the United States Marine Corps. And whatever else you want to say about the man, understand this. The Marines do not coddle anyone. They take raw material and they forge it into something harder. For Leon, that forge would prove to be the making of him as a fighter. He served from 1973 to 1976, rising to the rank of corporal. He was stationed at Marine Corps Base Camp Lejeune in North Carolina, and there he found his way onto the Marine Corps boxing team. For a young man who had grown up with so little structure and so few resources, the discipline of military life gave him something he had never fully had before: a routine, a standard, a relentless physical conditioning that would later become the secret weapon of his entire career. And he was not just filling out the roster. While in uniform, Leon Spinks won 3 consecutive All-Marine light heavyweight titles. 3 years running, he was the best the Corps had to offer at his weight. That is not luck. That is a man who took the toughness the Marines demanded and turned it into dominance. The conditioning Leon built in those years, the ability to keep going when other men would fold, would one day define the single most important night of his life. Because when he eventually faced a living legend across the ring, the world would watch in astonishment as Leon Spinks simply refused to tire. That endurance did not come from nowhere. It was built in the heat and grind of military training, long before anyone outside the boxing world knew his name. And while he was still in uniform, the amateur boxing world was beginning to whisper a name. That name was about to be carved into Olympic history, right alongside his own brothers. Let's talk about just how good Leon Spinks was as an amateur, because the numbers are almost hard to believe. By the time his amateur career was finished, he had compiled a record of 178 wins against only 7 losses. And of those 178 victories, 133 came by knockout. Stop and absorb that for a second. A destruction rate like that does not describe a careful point-scoring technician. It describes a man with rare and frightening power, a fighter who did not just beat opponents, but ended them. In the amateur ranks, where bouts are short and knockouts are far less common than in the professional game, putting away that many men is the signature of someone genuinely dangerous. And the hardware backed up the highlight reel. Leon won 3 consecutive National Amateur Athletic Union Light Heavyweight Championships from 1974 through 1976. The very first of those titles came against a man named Michael Dokes, who would himself go on to become a world champion. So even at the start of his run, Leon was not beating up on nobodies. He was already taking down future champions. By the year 1976, Leon Spinks was no longer some anonymous kid from St. Louis. Inside the world of amateur boxing, he was a feared name, a puncher with an eagle, globe, and anchor on his resume, and a trail of knockouts behind him. He stood on the edge of the biggest stage in all of world sport. And in the summer of 1976, in the city of Montreal, the Spinks name would not appear on just one gold medal. On a single historic night, it would appear on 2. The 1976 Summer Olympics in Montreal would become the stage for one of the most extraordinary family achievements in the history of the Games. Because the Spinks brothers, those 2 poor kids from St. Louis, did not just qualify, they conquered. Leon Spinks won the light heavyweight gold medal, and his brother Michael Spinks won the middleweight gold medal. 2 brothers, 2 gold medals, 1 single Olympic Games. It is the kind of story that sounds almost like fiction, the sort of thing a screenwriter would be told to tone down because audiences would never believe it. Think about the journey those 2 medals represented. Two black brothers, born into poverty in a city that had offered them next to nothing, now standing atop the Olympic podium with the world watching and the anthem playing. From hardship in St. Louis to the highest honor an amateur athlete can win. And they did it together in the same games, carrying the same family name. In a sport and a country where the odds had always been stacked against young men like them, this was a triumph that went far beyond medals and weight classes. For Leon, Montreal was the launching pad. Overnight, he was an Olympic champion, a young man with a gleaming gold medal and a gap-toothed grin that television cameras loved. Promoters took notice. The professional ranks, with all their money and all their danger, began to call. The amateur chapter was closing, and a far richer, far more perilous world was opening up in front of him. But no one, not the promoters, not the press, not even the most reckless gambler in Las Vegas, predicted what came next. Because in barely a year, with almost no professional experience to his name, Leon Spinks would find himself standing across the ring from the most famous athlete on the face of the earth. When Leon Spinks turned professional, he did not ease into the fight game the way most careful young fighters do. He came in fast, and the people steering his career moved him faster still. He made his professional debut in 1977, and from that first bell, the path he was placed on would defy every ordinary rule of how a boxer is supposed to be built. In the normal world of professional boxing, a young heavyweight earns his shot at the title slowly. He fights 20 times, 30 times, maybe more. He learns his trade against journeymen and contenders, accumulating hard lessons round by round, year by year. He bleeds, he stumbles, he grows. Only after that long apprenticeship does anyone dare to put him in front of a champion. Leon Spinks did almost none of that. By the time he climbed into the ring against Muhammad Ali, he was fighting in only his 8th professional bout. 8th. To put it plainly, this was widely regarded as the fastest path to the heavyweight title in boxing history. A man with barely a handful of professional fights to his name was being marched straight toward the most coveted prize in all of sport. And there were those who called the whole arrangement reckless to the point of madness. So how did it happen? Part of the answer is the gold medal. An Olympic champion carries a shine that promoters can sell, and Leon's name still glowed from that historic night in Montreal. Part of it was the boxing business itself, always hungry for a fresh story, always willing to gamble a raw talent against a big payday. And part of it, frankly, was the man on the other side. Because the man on the other side was Muhammad Ali, and Ali, the most famous athlete on the face of the earth, did not look at Leon Spinks and see a threat. He looked at an inexperienced kid, a green Olympian with almost no professional record, and he saw an easy night, a tune-up, a name to add to the ledger before bigger things. Why would the Ali camp agree to face an essentially untested fighter? Because on paper, there was nothing to fear. The numbers said this was a mismatch. The wise money said this was a coronation waiting to happen. That was the gamble. A rushed, raw fighter on one side, and a fading legend who expected to barely break a sweat on the other. And on the 15th of February, 1978, in Las Vegas, the legend stepped through the ropes expecting an easy evening. Instead, he walked straight into the upset that would shake the entire sport. The 15th of February, 1978, Las Vegas, Nevada. The arena was full, the cameras were rolling, and the boxing world was waiting to watch Muhammad Ali do what Muhammad Ali always did: dance, talk, dazzle, and win. Almost nobody in that building expected anything else. But something was wrong from the early rounds, and the longer the fight went, the clearer it became. The aging Ali had expected an easy night, and that expectation betrayed him. Leon Spinks was not playing the role of the overwhelmed underdog. He was outboxing the legend. And here is the detail that turned the impossible into the inevitable. Leon Spinks simply would not tire. Round after round, while Ali looked for a moment to coast, Leon kept coming, kept pressing, kept working. That endurance, forged years earlier in the grind of military training, was now on display in front of the entire world. By the closing moments, the unthinkable was happening. Reports from that night describe Ali ready to fall in the final seconds of the fight, worn down by a younger man who refused to slow. It was one of the rare bouts in which Muhammad Ali left the ring with a bruised and puffy face, the marks of a real fight written across the features of a man who had expected to barely be touched. When the scorecards were read, it was a 15-round split decision, and the decision went to Leon Spinks. In only his 8th professional fight, the poor kid from St. Louis was the heavyweight champion of the world. It was widely considered one of the biggest upsets in heavyweight boxing history. Now, consider what that victory truly meant in the long arc of Ali's storied career. Muhammad Ali had lost before, but his other defeats had come in non-title fights, or in bouts where Ali himself was the challenger trying to win a belt back. Leon Spinks holds a distinction no one else can claim. According to boxing history, he was the only man ever to take the heavyweight title directly from Muhammad Ali in a championship bout. Not a setback, not a tune-up. The crown itself, lifted from the head of the most famous athlete alive. The world reacted exactly as you would expect to such a shock. And just 4 days later, on the 19th of February, 1978, that gap-toothed grin landed on the cover of Sports Illustrated. The unknown Olympian had become, overnight, the most talked-about man in sport. For one shining moment, Leon Spinks was champion of the world. But the celebration would not last, because within months, a backroom decision by the sport's own governing body would begin pulling that hard-won crown apart, piece by piece. Here is where the fairy tale takes its first cruel turn, and it does not happen in the ring. It happens in the meeting rooms and politics of professional boxing, in the world of the sport's governing bodies, where titles can be given and taken by men who never throw a punch. After his stunning victory, Leon Spinks faced a choice about what to do next. The natural, expected move was to defend his title against the leading contender, a dangerous fighter named Ken Norton. But Leon and his camp had another option in front of them, and it glittered with money and history. They could grant Muhammad Ali an immediate rematch. The biggest name in the sport, the most lucrative fight imaginable, against the man Leon had just dethroned. Leon chose Ali. He chose the rematch. And the World Boxing Council, the WBC, did not take kindly to that decision. Because Spinks refused to defend his portion of the world title against Ken Norton, the WBC stripped that title from him. And then, in a stroke of a pen, they awarded it to Norton, who became champion without ever having to beat the man who held the belt. Think about how strange and bitter that is. Leon Spinks had walked into the ring and beaten Muhammad Ali to earn that championship. He had done it the hardest way imaginable. And now, a piece of that crown was simply taken away and handed to someone else. Not because he lost a fight, but because he would not fight the man the organization wanted him to fight. This was the first crack in the story. It was a hard lesson in the realities of the fight business, where the alphabet organizations and their rules could undo in a meeting what a man had earned with his fists. And it raises a question worth sitting with. Who truly benefited from that arrangement? Did the rush toward the enormous Ali money rematch, the chase after the biggest possible payday, end up costing Leon Spinks his footing in the sport at the very moment he should have been consolidating his reign? He had chosen Ali over Norton, money and legend over a quieter, safer defense. And on the 15th of September 1978, inside a packed Louisiana Superdome, that choice was about to come due in front of tens of thousands of witnesses. The Louisiana Superdome, the 15th of September 1978. If the first fight had been an ambush, the second one was something entirely different. Because the Muhammad Ali who walked into that arena was not the overconfident, undertrained legend who had been embarrassed in Las Vegas 7 months earlier. This time, Ali was sharp. This time, Ali was in shape. He had been humiliated once, and the greatest of his era was not about to let it happen again. The same endurance that had carried Leon Spinks to victory in the first fight now ran into a focused, disciplined master who had prepared for exactly that challenge. Where the first Ali had grown tired and sloppy, this Ali was measured, patient, and precise. The result was a reversal of everything that had happened in February. Ali rarely lost control of the bout, boxing with the experience and craft that had made him a legend in the first place. When the 15 rounds were over, the decision was unanimous, and it belonged to Muhammad Ali. He had won back the heavyweight title, and in doing so, he made history of his own, becoming the first 3-time lineal heavyweight champion the sport had ever seen. For Leon Spinks, the loss carried a weight far heavier than a single defeat. Understand what had just happened in the timeline of his life. That victory over Ali in February had been the absolute peak of his career. And now, only 7 months later, that peak was already behind him. He was still young. He was still, in the eyes of the public, a famous man. But the single greatest day of his professional life had already come and gone. That is a haunting place for any athlete to find himself. Most men spend their entire careers climbing toward a summit they hope is still ahead. Leon Spinks had reached his summit almost by accident, in a flash, in only his 8th professional fight, and then watched it recede behind him before he had even turned 26. What does a man do when his greatest moment is already in the past, and the long years stretch out ahead of him with nowhere higher left to climb? The answer, sadly, would be written in the fights that followed. And less than a year later, in the glamour and bright lights of Monte Carlo, the fall would turn brutal. A single round, and it would be over. After losing the title back to Ali, Leon Spinks needed to rebuild. He needed wins, momentum, a reason for the boxing world to believe in him again. What he got instead, in his only fight of 1979, was one of the most jarring nights of his career. The setting was Monte Carlo, a place built for glamour and high stakes. His opponent was a fighter named Gary Coetzee, a man who would go on to become a WBA World Heavyweight Champion in his own right. And what happened was swift and shocking. Coetzee knocked Leon Spinks out in the very first round. The former heavyweight champion of the world, the man who had outlasted Muhammad Ali over 15 grueling rounds, was finished before the fight had barely begun. For a man who had built his name on endurance, on never tiring, a first-round knockout was a cruel and stunning kind of message. But Leon was not done. There was still fight in him, and there would be another real chance. After a strong performance against a fighter named Bernardo Mercado, Spinks earned his way back into the conversation and secured a shot at the heavyweight title once more. The champion this time was Larry Holmes, one of the finest heavyweights the sport has ever produced, a man in the prime of a long and dominant reign. That fight came on the 12th of June, 1981, and it would prove to be Leon's last genuine opportunity to reclaim the heavyweight championship of the world. It did not go well. By the third round, the picture had become painful to watch. Leon was taking punches without answering back, absorbing punishment while unable to mount any meaningful return. And so, the referee did what referees are there to do. He stepped in and stopped the fight, protecting the fighter from himself. With that stoppage, the door to the heavyweight title quietly closed for good. The man who had stunned the world in 1978 would never again stand on the threshold of that crown. He was still fighting, still chasing, still climbing back into rings, but the highest level of the sport, the place he had briefly ruled, was now permanently out of reach. What remained for Leon Spinks was a long road downward through the lower rungs of the fight game, and along that road lay one of the strangest and most troubling chapters of his entire career, a bout shadowed by a falsified record and a dark corner of the boxing business that would only come to light much later. By the 1990s, the fighter who had once dethroned a living legend was something else entirely. He was an aging name on the undercards, a former champion trading on a memory, taking fights wherever they came and for whatever they paid. And it was in this stretch, in the year 1994, that something happened so unlikely it had never occurred before in the history of the division. Leon Spinks stepped into the ring against a man named John Carlo, and he lost by knockout. That alone might have been forgettable, just another defeat in a long string of them. But there was a detail that made this one extraordinary. John Carlo was making his professional debut. It was his very first fight. And so Leon Spinks became the first former heavyweight champion ever to lose to a boxer fighting for the first time as a professional. The story behind that bout, though, was darker than a single shocking result. According to boxing records, the promoter who set it up, a man named Charles Farrell, later admitted that he had falsified Carlo's record in order to get the fight sanctioned by the District of Columbia. In other words, the night was built on a deception. The numbers on paper had been arranged to make a mismatch look acceptable to the officials who approve such things. A former world champion had been fed into a setup, and the truth only surfaced afterward. That is how far the road had descended. From a Las Vegas ring full of flashbulbs to a quietly manipulated bout in Washington, the distance was almost too great to measure. There was one more bell to come. In 1995, at the age of 42, Leon climbed through the ropes one final time and lost an 8-round decision to a fighter named Fred Hope, a man who had himself been away from the sport for 17 years before returning. And with that loss, the career was over. The man who had reached the summit in only his 8th professional fight walked away for good after a defeat to an opponent emerging from nearly 2 decades of inactivity. There was, along the way, one of the stranger detours of his later years. During the 1990s, He worked for an organization called Frontier Martial Arts Wrestling, and in 1992, he won its world title. That made him only the second man in history, after the great Primo Carnera, to hold championships in both boxing and professional wrestling. It sounds like a curiosity, and it was, but strip away the novelty, and you see something sadder underneath. Here was a former heavyweight king, chasing relevance and a paycheck wherever he could find one, lending his famous name to whatever stage would have him. But the hardest blows of Leon Spinks' life were never thrown inside a ring. They came in 1990 with a phone call from East St. Louis. Of all the chapters in this man's life, this is the one that has nothing to do with belts or scorecards. In 1990, Leon's son, Leon Calvin, lost his life in a tragic shooting in East St. Louis. He was driving home when the heartbreaking event took his life, and the loss left a wound that no comeback, no title, and no amount of fame could ever begin to heal. What makes it more painful still is who that young man was and what he was reaching for. Leon Calvin had been an aspiring professional boxer, just beginning to find his footing in the same sport that had defined his father. He carried a professional record of 2 wins and no losses. And here is the detail that lands like a hammer. Those 2 professional bouts had taken place only about a month before he passed away. He was right at the start of his own journey, his career barely begun, his future still entirely unwritten, when it was taken away. Think about the cruelty of that timing. A father who had stood atop the entire sport, watching a son take his very first steps down the same path, and then losing him, almost in the same breath. The dream and the tragic end pressed up against one another, separated by only a few short weeks. And there is a deeper, devastating irony woven through the whole Spinks story. This was a family that boxing had lifted out of poverty in St. Louis and carried all the way to 2 Olympic gold medals on a single historic night in Montreal. The sport had been their salvation, their way out, the great equalizer that turned poor kids into champions. And yet, the same family, for all that triumph, was also touched by violence and grief far outside the ropes. The glory and the sorrow lived under one name. For Leon, who had already watched his greatest professional moments slip behind him years earlier, this was a loss of an entirely different magnitude. There is no rematch for grief. There is no training camp that prepares a man for it. He carried it, as parents in his situation must, for the rest of his days. And yet, even in the shadow of mourning, the Spinks name kept making history. Because his brother Michael was about to accomplish something that only one family in the world had ever achieved. Step back from Leon for a moment and look at the larger family portrait, because it is one of the most remarkable in the history of American sport. We already know that Leon and Michael won Olympic gold together in 1976, but the brothers were not finished relighting the record books. In 1985, Michael Spinks did something stunning. He faced Larry Holmes, the same dominant champion who had stopped Leon 4 years earlier, and in a controversial upset, Michael defeated him to claim the IBF Heavyweight Championship. With that victory, something unprecedented happened. Leon and Michael Spinks became the only brothers in history to have both held World Heavyweight Championships. 2 siblings from a hard St. Louis neighborhood, each one a king of the most prestigious title in all of sport. That distinction was not a passing footnote. The Spinks brothers held it alone for roughly 2 decades until the Klitschko brothers, Vitaly and Vladimir, came along and matched the feat many years later. For 20 years, no other family on earth could claim what these two poor kids from Missouri had built with their fists. And the family thread did not stop with the brothers. Leon's son Corey Spinks carried the tradition into a new generation and a new era. Corey rose to hold the undisputed welterweight title, and he became the IBF junior middleweight champion, not once, but twice. So across the family, you have Olympic gold, a heavyweight crown for each brother, and a son who reigned as champion in his own right. By any measure, this is boxing royalty. But here is the contrast that sits at the aching center of it all. While the Spinks name continued to glitter in arenas and on championship belts, the man who started it all, the brother who had beaten Muhammad Ali himself, was quietly sliding in the opposite direction. As his family's legend grew, Leon's own circumstances grew smaller. The fame was fading. The money was disappearing. And the comfortable security that should have come with all he had accomplished was nowhere to be found. And so we return to that haunting image we began with. Because by 2005, the brother who had stunned the world was no longer signing big money contracts. He was pushing a mop. By 2005, the public record told a story almost too stark to believe. The man who had once held the heavyweight championship of the world was living in the quiet town of Columbus, Nebraska, and earning his living with a mop and a cleaning cart. Press reports and public records documented that he was working as a janitor at a YMCA and also at a McDonald's. A Boston Globe article that December captured the whole arc in 2 words. They titled it, "Riches to Rags." It is important to be careful here and honest. The sourced record does not hand us a tidy ledger of exactly where every dollar went, nor a catalog of the specific choices that led from the championship to the cleaning supply closet. What it does give us is the undeniable contrast itself, and that contrast speaks loudly enough on its own. The same hands that had lifted a world title in Las Vegas were now wiping down counters and emptying bins in small-town Nebraska. The fall, whatever its precise causes, was real and it was documented. For a stretch, Leon made a living as a headliner on year-round touring autograph shows, traveling from venue to venue and selling pieces of his fame, one signature at a time. There is something poignant in that picture. A man who had been on the cover of Sports Illustrated, reduced to monetizing the memory of a single February night, scrawling his name for fans who wanted a brush with history. Yet the full picture of his later life is more complicated than pure tragedy, and fairness demands we say so. In time, Leon eventually settled in Las Vegas, the very city where he had achieved his greatest triumph. And in his later years, he told a reporter that his life was, in his own word, comfortable, and that he kept a low profile. That is not the portrait of a man consumed by bitterness. It is the picture of someone who had made a kind of peace, living quietly, far from the roar he had once known. But peace of mind is one thing. The body and the brain keep their own ledger, and the punishment Leon Spinks had absorbed across decades inside the ropes was about to present its final, sobering bill. The damage done in a long boxing career does not always announce itself right away. Sometimes it gathers slowly, quietly, hidden beneath the surface for years before it finally shows. For Leon Spinks, the signs eventually became impossible to ignore. After his fighting days were over, people noticed that he had begun to slur his words, the speech of a man whose body bore the marks of every round he had ever fought. Then came the medical reality. In 2012, a diagnosis revealed serious neurological damage, specifically a shrinkage in his brain, which doctors linked directly to the accumulated punishment his head had endured over decades in the ring. This was the true and lasting cost of the fight game, written into the tissue of a man's mind. The same sport that had given him gold medals and a world title had also, blow by blow across the years, exacted a price that no purse could ever repay. There were other battles in those final chapters. In 2014, he was hospitalized twice for surgery to address abdominal complications, and from those he recovered. But in 2019 came the gravest news of all. It was revealed publicly that Leon had been diagnosed with advanced prostate cancer, and on the 5th of February, 2021, he passed away at a hospital in Henderson, Nevada. He was 67 years old. Before the end, there had been moments of recognition and grace. In 2009, he took part in a documentary called Facing Ali, in which a group of fighters who had once shared the ring with Muhammad Ali reflected on how that experience had changed their lives. And in August of 2017, he received a lasting honor when he was inducted into the Nevada Boxing Hall of Fame, alongside his brother Michael. The two who had stood on the Olympic podium together were enshrined together once more. So how do we measure a life like this one? It cannot be reduced to a single number or a single night. Here was a man who rose from poverty, who found discipline in the Marines, who conquered as an amateur, who stood with his brother atop the Olympic world, and who then, in only his 8th professional fight, did the impossible and beat the most celebrated athlete of his age. And here, too, was a man who lost his crown in months, who buried a son, who pushed a mop for an hourly wage, and who paid for his glory with his own health. That is the full, unvarnished truth of Leon Spinks. Not a punchline, and not a simple cautionary tale, but something far more human. A fighter who touched the very top of the mountain, however briefly, and then walked the long, hard road down the other side with whatever dignity he could carry. The belt is gone. The grin, that famous gap-toothed grin, lives on in the memory of everyone who watched him shock the world. And in the end, that single, shining, impossible night belongs to him forever. No governing body, no decline, and no passage of time can ever strip it away.